You just type digits into a computer and create new credit, new money, right? So this is how the banking system really works.
What? What did you say?
97% of the money supply is created in this way.
Shut it down! Shut it down!
After a deluded gunman assassinated President Kennedy, Shut it down!
Modern monetary theory isn't going to take care of this problem.
Oh, that's. I was going to say something I shouldn't say on television. That's garbage.
You're with Jay Powell on this one.
Yeah, it doesn't. Yeah.
Let me say, I haven't really seen a carefully worked out, description of what is meant by MMT, was what you're mentioning.
Yes, sir.
It may exist, but I haven't seen it. I have heard some pretty extreme claims attributed to that framework, and I don't know whether that's fair or not.
Raising taxes does not help modern economic growth. And more importantly, yes, I'm a big believer that deficits do matter. I'm a big believer that deficits are going to be driving interest rates much higher, and it could drive it to an unsustainable level.
The idea that deficits don't matter for countries that can borrow in their own currency, I think is just wrong. I think U.S. debt is fairly high at a level of GDP, and much more importantly than that, it's growing faster than GDP, fairly significantly faster. We're not even close to primary balance, which means, the deficit before interest payments. So we're going to have to either spend less or raise more revenue.
If you were to ask the public how money is created, they would probably say that money is created through governments or central banks. Of course, as we know, as we previously discussed, the money supply is created by commercial banks, right? Whenever they extend credit, right, they create new credit out of nothing by typing digits into a computer.
It's a fucking disgrace.
Therefore, when we think about the credit creation theory of banking, banks hold immense power in any society because they can dictate who gets money and for what purpose. Since the deindustrialization of Western nations, banks have overwhelmingly created credit for asset transactions, which has precipitated various boom and bust cycles. Of course, the regulators of this system, the central bankers, are ultimately responsible for these cycles.
So, central bankers create cycles. How have the central bankers, this is my last slide because my 12 minutes is just up, have reacted to the truth coming out? They admit that they've been telling porkies, and now they propose to increase their power. So central bankers belatedly admit, oh, now that you've mentioned it, yes, banks create the money supply. So let's abolish that now.
Throughout American history, those who have attempted to resist private central banks and bring money creation under the control of the government have met untimely deaths or assassination attempts. Many are quick to forget that there were two central banks before the Fed. They were both 20% government, 80% privately owned. The first Bank of the United States started with a capitalization of $10 million, $2 million of which was owned by the government, and the remaining $8 million by private investors. The first bank was criticized by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who claimed that the bank was unconstitutional and that it benefited merchants and investors at the expense of the majority of the population. They believed the centralization of power away from local banks was dangerous to a sound monetary system. The US Senate tied on a vote to renew the bank's charter. However, Vice President George Clinton broke the tie and voted against renewal, and the bank's charter therefore expired in 1811. Just 5 years later, the Second Bank of the United States started with a capitalization of $35 million, $7 million of which was owned by the government and the remaining $28 million by private investors. Andrew Jackson viewed the bank as a corrupt institution, dangerous to American liberties. Jackson vetoed the Recharter Bill and easily won re-election in 1832 on his anti-bank platform. In 1833, Jackson removed all federal funds from the Second Bank, redistributing them to various state banks. Jackson succeeded in destroying the bank, and its charter officially expired in 1836. On January 8, 1835, Jackson became the first and only US president to pay off the entire national debt. All of this has nothing to do with his attempted assassination on January 30th, 1835, by the way. Despite being the first US president to experience an assassination attempt, he was not the last. The Federal Reserve is not federal and has no reserves. Federal Reserve banks are set up like private corporations. Member banks hold stock in the Federal Reserve banks and earn dividends. After expenses are paid, dividends at 6% per annum on paid-in capital are paid to the stockholders, i.e. the member banks. The US dollar is the global reserve currency, and therefore the Federal Reserve gets to determine the allocation of resources and authority within every society that has a demand for US dollars. Every society has a demand for US dollars, since it is the global reserve currency. Bitcoin is, to an extent, an attack on the US dollar, but it is not necessarily a Chinese weapon. As Peter Thiel recently alluded to, it is a sovereign weapon. Sovereign meaning individuals, corporations, institutions. It will likely be the money of choice for sovereign entities.
I do wonder whether, at this point, Bitcoin is also should also be thought in part of as a Chinese financial weapon against the U.S., where it threatens fiat money, but it especially threatens the U.S. dollar, and China wants to do things to weaken it. So it's sort of China is long Bitcoin, and perhaps from a geopolitical perspective, the U.S. should be a little bit be asking some tougher questions about exactly how that works.
The question I would raise, and maybe another time Mark and I could talk about it, does it change the need for dollar reserve as a reserve currency if there was a true digital currency that was separated from dollar-based assets and other things like that?
When Bitcoin and the so-called Finance 2.0 infrastructure wins, humans will finally be free to decide authority and resources within their own societies via whatever sorting mechanism each individual wants to engage with. After centuries of central bank enslavement, humans will be free. That is, those who are aware will be free. Those who are not aware of what is unfolding will be forced to adopt the totalitarian CBDC mark of the beast diet. So it is important to be aware of the long-term implications of Bitcoin. The central banking cartel will likely cement their power and even extend it via CBDCs. Therefore, accumulating assets that appreciate in terms of purchasing power, such as Bitcoin, becomes pivotal if one wants to join the ranks of the sovereign entities and quietly exit the rigged clown world fiat economy. Let's take a look at the purchasing power of the US dollar since the formation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. Now, the Minneapolis Fed uses CPI to assess how far your dollar goes today compared with previous years. This produces a loss of purchasing power of around 97% since 1913, but let's not use CPI, let's look at gold. In 1913, $100 would get you around 4.8 ounces of gold. Today, $100 would get you just over 0.05 ounces of gold. This produces a loss of purchasing power closer to 99%. Not good. The system wants the participants to consume more. The system wants to tax the participants without them noticing, which is exactly what inflation does. Deflation destroys the ability of debt-ridden governments to inflate this debt away.
Are you worried about debt and deficits? The debt is pretty high, 27 trillion or so, and the annual deficit is now about 2.5 to 3 trillion or so. Is that a concern to the Fed in terms of impacting inflation?
So yes, in the over time and in the longer run, the U.S. federal budget is on an unsustainable path, meaning simply that the debt is growing meaningfully faster than the economy, and that's by definition unsustainable over time.
Are U.S. Treasury bonds still safe to invest in?
Very much so. I think this is not an issue of credit rating. The United States can pay any debt it has because we can always print money to do that. So there is zero probability of default.